In today's lesson, we're going to discuss how to build modal panels. A modal panel is any kind of panel that only shows up under certain circumstances, not all the time. And we can build that using the container property we discussed yesterday. So imagine we have a dashboard being rendered inside some sidebar inside our application that we're looking at right now. If we wanted to define a modal to be rendered, we can use, as mentioned, the container property. Set it to root, meaning that it'll render in the root of the HTML document, and we can start building it. I'll just give it a static size, 50% of the viewport width. That's a bit too big. Let's make it 20% of the width and 50% of the viewport height. We don't need to do this now. Don't need the main axis or cross axis. There we see it over there. And we of course need to give it absolute positioning. And there we have it centered. In some cases you'll have to center it manually. You can do that by doing left 50%, top 50%, and then use the transform property to translate it back. This is because if you don't do it, setting it to 50%, 50% will just have the top left position in the middle of the document. So you can always use this kind of property to translate it back. Translate meaning move, essentially. So we'll need to give this a relative ID so we can access it. Let's call this dashboard, and let's just call this one modal. And let's hide this one by default, because normally modals will be hidden. Now it's gone, and now we can add a button to go show it again. The target is the relative ID, so it'll be dashboard.modal. Let's make this true, of course. So then clicking on this will show our modal. And of course we need a way to close the modal as well. So let's add a button inside it. That's just a copy of this one. And this will be hide modal. Show, hide. So of course a modal will normally be inside a trait. So let's make a trait for this. I normally just copy it completely. New file. Modal. And then we can just put our accept props in there. So now we have this relative ID in here. We should move it out because this relative ID is only relevant to the dashboard inside we're working. Let's put that over there. And let's add the traits. So now we have this scope over there of dashboard, the relative ID of modal, and this obviously relates to the actual component, the modal itself. But something we'll often do when we do move things to traits is it's best to have a new scope to work in over here. Let's call this my modal, or let's call it modal, I guess. Now we have two ways of accessing this component. From the outside, we can access it through the scoped ID, dashboard.modal, because that's what this dashboard knows. This dashboard only knows about this relative ID. This dashboard does not know about the scope in here, nor should it. Um, it should be hidden information. And if we want to access it from inside, if we want to access this thing from inside, we can just access the scoped ID modal. And this is because, as mentioned, this dashboard should not know what happens inside this trait. It shouldn't care about what the scope is inside or anything else. It should be completely closed off to this dashboard. Internally, this button shouldn't know what relative ID and dashboard this modal is being used in because it can be used in multiple places. That's why we give it a new scope. So this scope can only be used internally. Any other traits inside this modal can also access this scope, because it's kind of like a blocked off unit of functionality that just accesses this one. So the next thing we need to look at is component state within invisible components. So if I add a inputs in here, just do this. I've got an input. Give it a placeholder of we've got our input. When it shows again, you'll see that this is gone. That's because this component has unmounted. This input is unmounted. When something becomes visible for the first time, all components inside it are mounted for the first time. And when this component hides, so when the inputs and the button is no longer visible because their parent is invisible, they are unmounted. They're no longer there. We do this for performance purposes so that we don't have tons of components being mounted internally, but they're not actually rendering. So now we have a problem that if we wanted to set a state on this input, we don't have a way of accessing it. To illustrate that, let's give this one an ID for now of I1, and let's also do another set state to actually target I1 to set the value. So you see this set state, that's the input key value is default. So we're setting the value to a bunch of exclamation marks. And you'll see it has been set. Not really illustrating my point, but that's because we're doing this the wrong way around. And just because it mounts fast enough for the component to actually find it. Even this will probably still be fast enough. There we see it doesn't work now because right now we're setting the state before the dashboard becomes, well, before the modal becomes visible and the input becomes visible. So trying to set the states on it doesn't work because the component simply isn't there yet. Which is just as well because this would be really bad practice. We shouldn't know anything happening inside a modal. All we know about a modal is the properties we can set. So we could, for example, go and set the value here, but this also only happens the first time. The first time the trait is built and the component mounts, this will be passed in. We can accept the property, put it inside the input. But if we wanted to change it dynamically like we want to do here with the script, we're out of luck. So as mentioned, it would be bad practice because we shouldn't know what the IDs are internally. So the best way to do this is to see your trait as an interface. Um, we have interface to do things that go into the trait and also ways to get information out of the trait. And the only thing we can um, really, um, um, the only thing we're really sure of that will exist is this component, nothing inside it. So we can see this component as an interface in a way. A good way to do this, and something that you should standardize, is to define something like this. This isn't used by Opus in any way, the interface, but it is a good way for you to keep track of what this thing does. So we can do something like um, let's set a property called t set, or let's just do input value. You can say it's type of string, direction in, meaning it'll come into this component. It isn't going out into somewhere else. we could default this as well, and it is good practice to put it over here. So now we're defining this property that we defined in our interface, which again, Opus doesn't do anything with this. We're just using it for our own, to keep track of things. So I can put input value over there. I could give it a default value of maybe just an empty string. And what we can do now is we can put a flow on this input. It's from the modal, which is of course this thing up there. From key is input value, and we're flowing it to ourselves, to our own value, so we can ignore the rest. So now whenever we set this thing, which is part of our interface, input value, we know it'll flow to this input. So now we can change this set state to a set multi-state. Set input value. And now that should work. So there's our interface working. We're getting a value to come into it. This is the only way you should be setting things inside modals, is by setting something on the outside, which is then used by something on the inside. Similarly, we can do the same kind of thing to get values out. If, for example, we had let's make a second input. If we wanted to get this value out again, let's define another interface for, let's just call it surname, and direction is out, just for our purposes to keep track of. Let's put surname on there. And let's put a input just under the button to store the surname. So what we want to do now, obviously, is get the value of the surname, which is over there, and put it into this input over there. So what we can do now is we can flow from this component, because we know there's an interface defined over there. We don't do it in here because this can be used in multiple places. The component on the outside wants to do with it. So in the case of something that comes in, an interface value that comes in, we'll do something inside the traits. We're getting a value in and we're putting it inside this input over there. So we don't need this flow, of course, on the surname. So in the other case, what we'll need to do is on this input, we can now define a flow. This will be from dashboard.modal, which is the value I know, the scoped ID I know inside my dashboard. From key is surname, and to key will be to my own value. So now we're not setting anything in a way that'll break, because we're not accessing anything inside the modal. We're just accessing a state on this component itself. So there's no value set at the moment. And if I do type in there, we'll see nothing is happening. That's because we haven't set our flow up yet over there. So we will need a flow for this one. We're setting the modal, and we're setting the surname key. And there we see that populating over there. So two kinds of principles, just to reiterate. In the case where we want to set something inside the modal, we have an interface for values that come in. What we'll do is we'll define it over there. We'll put the state on the outside, on the modal itself, and then the thing that wants to ingest it can have a flow that reads from the parent, the scope in which we reside, from the key we want to read. In the case where we want to get something out, we also define that interface value, the interface variable. It's going to go out. We still define it there because the state will still reside on this component. We flow into it, so we're setting this value whenever this input changes, and then on the outside we are allowed to reference this key over there, because this key is something that's in our interface. It isn't some random thing that we're flowing. We can flow other things as well. You are allowed to access things like enabled or viz, for example. So now we're flowing from the viz states of the modal into this surname input. So then we can see it's false at the moment. And if we click on this, we can see it becomes true. So anything that's there by default, you can flow from, or these, any normal property. But if it's something else, something specific to your use case, it is best to define it over there, so that when someone reads this trait and wonders how to use it, they will see these are the values they can pass in. They'll know it'll do what it needs to do, and these are the values that they can read also on the outside.